Hi, it's Keith Townsend from the CTOadvisor.com with another Periscope coffee chat. Morning to the folks out there. So, we're going to talk a little bit about big data and specifically challenges that it brings to the infrastructure. I had the pleasure of attending Intel Data Center Group's Influencer Day this past week. And one of the things that they did, they took us to OHSU, which is a provide or a research facility researching cancer. Amazing. The team does amazing work. I highly suggest that you guys go check out their website and some of the work that they're doing. But a lot of the work that they're doing and a lot of the technology that they're being enabled with brought up some pretty salient challenges that's faced when you're working with big data. They're doing human genomics, and therefore human genomics creates a great deal of data, massive amounts of data. So I think the numbers that I saw, a couple of numbers that I saw, they had a really cool, I know I'm going to get this name wrong. It was a cryothermal electronic magnoscope that pretty much took the size of maybe 2 or 3 42U racks tall, set on a energy absorbing floor, and was an amazingly complex piece of machinery that creates about 27 terabytes of data a day. That data creates imagery data, which then can be analyzed by researchers. Then on the other end of the piece, when you're talking about creating actual genomic data, this data, if you were to sequence all the genomes or if you were to sequence all the genomic data of all the cancer patients annually, it will be something around 4 exabytes of data. 4 exabytes of data. That's an awful lot of data. Beyond the fact of how do you store all of that data in a single location, the question becomes, how do you collaborate on that data? When you're a large facility like OHSU, who couldn't even collect all the data by themselves, you still need to make the data available to other researchers. A lot of business challenges kind of come up with that as well. So it's data, and data is valuable. So whether you're a non-for-profit research provider such as OHSU or a for-profit company like the one that I work for, there's a challenge that you want to protect your IP. You want to share the data with your community, but you also want to share the parts of the data that you own. You want to control that. So how do you share that data? This is where I think cloud solves a challenge that traditional infrastructure cannot solve. One, you can't, as a single entity, unless you're like the US government or something, you can't afford to store that much data. 4 exabytes of data is just incomprehensible. I think to give it some perspective, the numbers that they compared it to is that 5 exabytes of data is every word spoken ever mentioned in human language, so in daily communication. That's the enormity of the amount of data that would be generated, even if they could solve the problem. How do you get all of this data into a system? Secondly, how do you share the data? I mean, from a practical perspective, if I'm a researcher and I need to run, if I have the CPU capacity to run queries against that data, the data has to be somewhat local to the machines running the data. So I could, in theory, put all this stuff in AWS and have AWS workloads from different regions running on it. But AWS doesn't solve the business challenge or the technical challenge of every solution. This is why the industry needs what Primary Data, the company that I linked into the title of this coffee talk, you need this concept of data virtualization, where you can virtualize where the data exists versus how the data is connected to the end system. You know, end systems consume this data in various ways. One way is to present the data as an NFS share. So, we're getting into the technology a little bit. When we talk about storage virtualization, where I can connect the data, I do wonder how much a exabyte of data. I don't even know how much an exabyte of data would cost in physical storage, let alone on S3. But that's a good question. Going back to the physical challenges of presenting the data, different systems present the data in different ways. Some of it is by NFS, and I could create a NFS share and store the data or share the data that way, even though 4 exabytes would be a crazy amount of a crazy NFS share, and I don't know if that would work. Block storage doesn't work at that level. How do you present and go through that data? So I don't have solutions to any of this. I think it's a great conversation to talk about of how do you virtualize that data, and then from a physical infrastructure perspective, how do you physically share the data across virtually the globe? Right now, we're just talking about U.S.-based companies and research facilities, but how do you make that data physically possible? And then how do you control access control, meaning the metadata? How do I share the valuable metadata that I want to share? How do I share the actual data? And how do I compartmentalize the components of the metadata and the physical data that I want to share across universities? And how do I get past the problem of duplicate data, changes to the data, data sovereignty? Just a lot of questions that came up as part of the discussions with Intel and OHSU. This is actually really, in the medical world, this is some old and new problems. I think the new problem is just within the past couple of years, 2 to 3 years, the price of genomics and genetic sequencing has come down by multitudes, from the millions of dollars into the thousands of dollars or $1,000 range per patient. So the technology is more available. If a technology is more available, that means that it's more likely to be used. So just within the past couple of years, we've seen the explosion of data. Then coming from the side of the imagery, when we're taking the physical image of something, slicing it down, they showed me another microscope, which is a light, I can't remember the name, but it's a light scanning slicing microscope that will slice a piece of genetic material down to as little as 4 nanometers of thickness. To give some perspective, the latest Intel manufacturing process is 14 nanometers. So you can take a Intel transistor and a 14 nanometer transistor and carve it into 3 to 4 sections of layers, and do that across the entire, let's say, 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter genetic piece of material, and that creates an incredible amount of data. How do you analyze that data and how do you share that data are relatively new challenges in the community. So I was really excited to see. I'm digging a little bit more into the science behind cancer research, and specifically the challenges when translating to the data that's created through all the vehicles that they have now to perform this research. Expect a lot of writing from me over the next couple of months around the work that they're doing at OHSU. It's important work in and of itself, but I think the big data and IT community in general have a lot to learn about the challenges that these researchers are encountering, and how do we solve those challenges ourselves. That's it for this particular episode of Coffee Periscope Chats. Talk to you guys maybe in the next couple hours as I think it's some new material. Talk to you guys later.